Welcome back to episode 24 of the Thinking 8 podcast. So today, Professor Stephen Fortescue is kindly enough to join me. So Professor Fortescue is an author and old Deputy President of the University of New South Wales Academic Board, Director of Postgraduate Research for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. He's a political scientist in the School of Social Sciences and International Studies, whose research is focused on the contemporary Russian policy-making process and the Russian mining and metals industry, with an expertise in Russian politics and economics. Although retired from UNSW, he remains active in the academic study of Russian domestic policymaking. I hope that's all correct. And Stephen was kind enough to come on to kind of explain everything going on with Russia and Ukraine at the moment and give a bit of a background of his own field. So thank you so much for coming on, Professor. Do you want to start by telling us a bit about yourself? And then I inevitably want to get involved in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, get your opinion and your views on it, but maybe start off with a bit about how you got into the academia.
Okay, I'm standard Anglo-Australian background, got no family connections whatsoever with Russia. I guess at school, in final year at school, we did Russian history at school, the Russian Revolution in the final year, and that was in 1968 in Canberra. I must have been quite interested in what was going on because I remember really well, one of those sorts of days that I can remember exactly where it happened and everything, hearing about the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia and being really upset. So I must have had that interest even then in my final year at school. So anyway, when I came to go to university, which was in Canberra, that's where I grew up, I never thought about studying Russian or anything like that. I just thought I'd do politics and economics, which was two things that interested me. And I had a spare little empty space in my program in first year, and I went along to some advisor and said, what should I do? And she said, oh, what about a language? I said, oh yeah, what languages do you have? And French, German,
Yeah. Russian,
oh yeah, and I knew it had that sort of exotic alphabet, and I like to do things that are a little bit different. So I thought, yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
So at the end of first year, I got my best result ever in economics 1 and gave it up to do Russian, in which I got my worst result ever. I've got no natural talents for languages. Yeah. But anyway,
neither do I.
I loved studying it. I loved learning it, although I wasn't very good at it. So I kept up the politics and the politics and the Russian and did a PhD in that. Went to Russia for the first time to Moscow University on an exchange when I was doing my PhD in 1975. It was all pretty grim, but I was just totally fascinated, and I've been obsessed with the place ever since. I have a Russian wife, and we have a flat in Moscow and a house out in the Russian countryside. I'm not quite sure when, if ever, we'll get to see them again, but so I've spent quite a lot of time in Russia, and it's not just my professional interest, but it's just totally part of my life.
Wow. So it just called to you, I guess, from that first class in high school.
Yeah, that's at high school, and then just learning the language. As I said, I wasn't very good at it, and I didn't even try very hard. But it was strange. I got more satisfaction from learning Russian as badly as I did than all learning about demand supply functions and everything else like that, which in a way sort of came easy. But the Russian didn't come easy. Once I learned it, I had a fascination with the place, but once I learnt the language, I was really determined to use it. I didn't want to find myself in the situation that I lost the language and I lost the country. It was just terribly important to me.
So I've never been to Russia. I was planning to go actually before COVID 2 years ago, but that it didn't end up happening. What's Russia like in comparison to here or the West in general?
Yeah, well, that's a very big question. Obviously, I haven't been there since late 2019. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
For the same obvious reasons.
We
were all set to go off as well.
Yeah,
we actually put it off because my son announced he was getting married.
Yeah,
marriage didn't go ahead because of COVID. If it hadn't been for that, though, we'd probably still be stuck there because we would have been in Russia when COVID hit.
Hey, you wouldn't want to be there now, I'm guessing.
No, I wouldn't. It's very mixed feelings about what it'd be fascinating to be there to find out exactly what's going on and what's going on in people's heads and so on. But anyway, what it's like. If you went to Moscow, I don't know about now. I don't know about in COVID circumstances, in current circumstances. But when we were last there, Moscow is a remarkably modern, been rebuilt a lot in recent times. There's lots of stuff to do. It's a great place to be. I've always said that modern Moscow is a great cosmopolitan city, but without any foreigners, because that is one thing. If you go there from the West, if you went to Moscow from London, say, you'd just the lack of foreigners there is really, really noticeable. So there's that. But Moscow is a place to go. It's very strikingly. I used to sometimes think it's been built like the exemplary capital of a great empire, like Rome of the Roman Empire. It's got that quite imperial sort of feel if you want to approach it with that maybe prejudiced view, but it has. Once you get outside Moscow, we've got a house in about 400 kilometers from Moscow on the Volga River, and a very poor little, well, it's not a little village, sort of very small town, maybe 500 people now, which used to have a timber mill in Soviet times.
Oh, wow.
That's of course closed down, and it's very, very poor, and it's hard to say. It's not like Calcutta pavement dwellers, but it is very poor, and you'd be quite shocked, I think, at the way that people live. The levels of drunkenness that you see. I mean, that's declined, but only because most of the men have died of alcoholism.
Yeah. Wow.
So, there is something. To say third world is probably not really accurate, but it's quite different and quite challenging if you're not used to it. I think it's true to say.
What made you buy out there?
My wife is Russian, as I said.
Yeah.
She's a born and bred Muscovite.
Yeah. When
in the early 90s it became possible to buy property, after the collapse.
Really?
She was there on her own, and one day she rang me up. We didn't have a lot of money at the time. She rang me up and she said very nervously, I've bought a block of land. I said, oh yeah, how much does it cost? Oh, well, that's affordable, yeah. And a couple of weeks later, she rang up again and said, very nervously, I bought a house.
Yeah.
Oh my God, where? How much did it cost? I can remember it cost $3,000 US. And
oh, wow. Yeah.
Well, we couldn't afford to do that every day of the week, but just every now and then, that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I was really excited. And when I went, we just absolutely loved the place, despite the challenges of being there. It's on the river. It's not overly beautiful, but, you get those great long, summer twilights on the river that you get in those northern places where the sunset takes for hours and hours and hours. And in the wintertime, when you go there, okay, you don't get a lot of sunlight, but you get that light, and I love the cold weather. The river freezes over, you can just walk along the river as far as you like. We love it. We've got really close friends. And I didn't want to make it sound before as if they live in some sort of dreadful, hopeless conditions. It's not. It's a very challenging place, but people, they're normal people, and we have great friends there, and we love it. And it's just terribly sad at the moment to genuinely think, when and in what circumstances will we get back there? It's terribly upsetting.
Okay, I want to get to what's happening right now in the world, Russia, Ukraine, essentially. So I know people listening as well would probably generally my demographic and my understanding. So I don't really even know when the Soviet Union collapsed and when did Putin become in power essentially, and how long he's been in power for. I remember talking to my mum, and she was saying she remembers the Soviet Union collapsing when she was little. So I didn't realize how recent it was, to be honest, because I only learned about it in history books and things like that. So could you give me a rundown of that?
I don't need to hear you talking about that. It was actually my 70th birthday on the 21st of February.
Happy birthday. It's my girlfriend's birthday.
But nevertheless, I don't need reminding that your mother sort of vaguely remembers the collapse of the Soviet Union as a child. Oh, my goodness.
At least you've got your hair. Hey.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I brushed it very carefully before I came on. But so anyway, well, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. Well, no, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. We were actually in Russia and living there, with small children in 1990 into early 1991. And I mean, that was really, really tough. Again, in Moscow, it wasn't as if people were dying of starvation on the streets, but to find food to feed your family, that was, it was a bit of a challenge. The place had completely collapsed, and it was not much better through the first half in particular of the 1990s. It was a very challenging place to live, even in Moscow, and very violent and everything else like that. But anyway, so the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Putin came to power. He was actually appointed by Yeltsin, the first president, as his prime minister in 1999.
So, sorry, just to ask, so how did Yeltsin get into power? So the Soviet Union collapsed. So you lived there during that time?
Yeah, we weren't there precisely at the time of the collapse. We'd already left to come home. I was just there on sabbatical type things.
Yeah.
Look, it's a very complicated story, but the Soviet Union had all sorts of problems. I would say primarily economic problems. It just couldn't keep the economy going.
Yeah.
It had a system in which there was no incentives whatsoever to work. I worked in a Soviet publishing company in 1979, 1980. And although I knew I knew theoretically about the Soviet Union, I'd been there before at Moscow University, and I knew about the way the economy worked and everything in sort of theoretical terms. But it wasn't until I actually worked in this actual workplace, I never got used to how little work. Nobody did any work at all.
Were you paid? Like, how did it actually work?
Yeah, I was on a sort of an exchange from a British company, but I basically worked there for a year as an editor in the Russian publishing company. I got some salary in England and did some work on their behalf, but I just worked there and as an editor, just like everybody else.
Yeah.
So that was when things were getting very difficult economically, and that there were more and more queues, less and less to buy in the shops. And we're talking here about Moscow, which is the capital.
Yeah, so
by that stage, the rot had really set in, and was affecting the morale of the people quite seriously and noticeably. And at that stage, that was just when the war in Afghanistan started.
Yeah.
And that had a big effect on people as well, something that might become relevant to our discussion later. Once dead bodies come home, what's the response? So that decay, what was called the Era of Stagnation, was well and truly by 1979. And another relevant issue, perhaps for today, you couldn't replace people. Authoritarian regimes find it very hard to replace the elite. And so you got all these doddery old people who had no idea what was going on running the country. Now, I don't like saying Putin's old because he's actually 6 months younger than I am, but nevertheless, you start thinking there's no mechanism to replace him. He gets older and maybe he's just losing the plot. Anyway, I'm leaping from thing to thing.
That's okay.
I can't remember what I was talking about, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Yeltsin, yeah. Well, when things really got bad, you got all these ethnic issues, the different republics starting to want their independence, including, not to a terribly spectacular degree, but including Ukraine at that time. But other republics, the Baltic States, Georgia, really seriously demanding their independence. Gorbachev, who was the leader then, he was caught. He wanted to be a liberal. He wanted to let everybody do what they liked, but everything got out of control. So I wouldn't say the Soviet Union collapsed because of ethnic issues or the desire of independence of those republics, but it was sort of what brought it to the end in the end. Because Yeltsin, he won an election to be head of the Russian part of the Soviet Union, which was only one part of the Soviet Union. And then he and the Ukrainian leader and the then Belarusian leader got together and did this deal between each other saying that we'll go along and tell Gorbachev that the Soviet Union's all over. We're going to set up our own independent countries. The other parts of the Soviet Union can do what they like, but we're going to set up our own independent countries. They went along and told Gorbachev that, and Gorbachev just shrugged his shoulders and said, yeah, well, that's it, finish. And he just declared that that's the end of the Soviet Union. So Yeltsin then remained as the president of what had been the Russian part of the Soviet Union, but was now an independent Russia with an independent Ukraine, and all the other republics then broke up and became independent republics. That's, of course, what Putin has said on a number of occasions was the greatest geostrategic catastrophe of the 20th century, the breakup of the Soviet Union. So there are those that say that his project is to gather the lands back together, to get maybe not the whole Soviet Union, but those core, what he sees as the core parts of the Soviet Union, back as part of one country, or if not one country, at least independent countries that are not fully independent, let's say. So anyway, all that happened with Yeltsin and so on at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s. And then Putin came along, as I said, as prime minister in 1999. And
was he elected?
No, the prime minister is not elected. The prime minister is appointed by the president and confirmed by the parliament. There'd been a great long succession of prime ministers over in the last couple of years. And I have to say, I'll admit openly, at the time when I used this Putin, I'd sort of hardly heard of him, and I knew he was from the KGB, and I thought, well, that's not a good sign. I have deep and abiding prejudice against anybody from the KGB. But I assumed that he'd just go the way of all his predecessors. He'd be around for 6 months and Putin would sack him and get a new one. But Yeltsin made the decision that Putin would be his successor, and more or less arranged it that way. So it was in March 2000 that Putin won the election in which he was elected president. And he was elected, not with an overwhelming majority, but with a substantial majority, well, a convenient majority, let's say.
And do you think elections were rigged, or is it all just people voted him in and now he's just in power and he never left, or how does it exactly work, that system?
Yes and no. The initial election, I've got no reason to believe that it was particularly rigged. Obviously, this is a pretty rough and ready sort of place, and if you've got the media on your side, it makes a huge difference, and so on and so forth. And one way or the other, he had the media on his side mostly at that time. More generally, to answer your question, and as time went on and Putin became more established in power, whether elections for the presidency or for the parliament are rigged, yeah, sure, they're rigged. To what extent they're rigged is the big question. What would happen if they weren't rigged at all? We've generally been prepared to say that even in an unrigged election, Putin would do well and would likely win. But in the way of authoritarian leaders, he's not satisfied with getting 55% of the vote. He wants to get a vote that shows that he is really, really, really seriously popular. So the votes are rigged in order to ensure that they get the sort of result that they want to get, not necessarily whether he'd win or not, but an impressive result. When it comes to the parliament, again, that he's just absolutely certain that he's got a majority, that he can change the constitution if he wants to, and so on and so forth. A lot of the rigging, incidentally, is fiddling around with the counting of the votes, but most of it is just plain not letting uncomfortable or inconvenient candidates stand. They're just they're all just deregistered and not allowed to stand. And
is there technically a term end, the end of their term, and he just extended it because you said he has the power to do that? Or is
look, this is a very complicated story, but yes, the Russian constitution has term limits on the number of terms that a president can serve, and he's just either liberally interpreted the constitution or changed the constitution, as he did in 2020, to allow him to continue on in power. There was one time in 2008, he'd done 2 terms, and under the constitution that he couldn't be president anymore, and he actually spent 4 years as prime minister, and Medvedev was president. And at the end of those 4 years, the constitution was interpreted as saying, well, it was only two terms in a row. He could come back and have another 2 terms. So he came back in 2012, had another 2 terms. and now has changed the constitution that he can continue on having another
Indefinitely.
2 terms, I think, which would take him to an end where he's 84 or something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm.
So was it 9 days ago, I think, Russia declared war on Ukraine? Something
like that. It
yeah.
seems both, it seems like a long time ago, to be honest.
Honestly, I was talking today about it. I'm like, it feels like it was 6 months ago, and it was only
Yeah.
a week ago, really.
Yeah.
What do you think the end goal is, really?
Yeah, well, I think the very end goal, who knows? The end goal at the moment is just to make damn sure that Ukraine is on his side, not on the other side. I think I could put it as simply as that. That's probably also a lesson, seen as a lesson to other countries or that might see themselves in a similar position, and a lesson to the West that, this is my part of the world, and I will do what it takes to make sure that I have control of that part of the world. So I think that's the basic question. For me, this all started in December, wasn't it, when Putin presented to the West, to the United States and to NATO, these documents in which he said, you sign these documents within a week or we will take military technical measures.
What were the documents?
Well, these were documents in December that were presented, and they said, these are our security guarantees that we want, that you will guarantee that Ukraine and any other of these countries will not join NATO. You'll sign a document saying that they will not and never will join NATO, and that there will be no NATO forces held in countries that have joined NATO since 1997, which includes the Baltic States and all those other countries. And that was clearly, we might argue about whether it was, it would help Russian security to have this agreed or not, but it was clearly that these were unacceptable demands, and they were put forward as demands. I'd have to say at the time we all thought, I thought, well, how the hell is he going to dig himself out of this hole?
What was the leverage he had to make those demands?
Well, a threat to invade, Ukraine.
Yeah.
Because it was at this time that the force build-up started. At this time,
really,
yeah,
from December.
Oh yeah, it's been going on for some time.
Okay.
So okay, well, on the one hand we've got our demands, and on the other hand we've got all these troops on the border. And it's pretty clear that the United States had their invasion plans, and said they're going to do it, and kept saying they're going to do it, and they're going to do it. And I'd say, I thought, well, I'm not quite sure how he's going to get out of this, but he's not going to invade Ukraine, is he? I mean, he's not going to do anything that's stupid, that does everything you could possibly imagine to decrease the security of Russia, not increase the security of Russia. But anyway, as sometimes happens, the Americans had it right. They knew exactly what he was going to do, and he did it. So it started back then. But Putin's right from the very beginning has made it clear that he's not happy about security arrangements as they've developed in that part of the world. Russia is a great power. Russia deserves to have a sphere of influence. It deserves to have a sense that there is no threat to it
around its neighbours.
Territory. That's the argument that it makes, and it's got some logic to it, I suppose.
I'm sure there is.
As far as I'm concerned, enforcing that logic does nothing for the security of Russia. It just decreases the security of Russia. But that's the argument, and that argument has been around a long time. Putin, he did. I think he pretty sincerely tried for a number of years to do a deal with the West. It was only in 2007 when he made a famous speech to the Munich security, what do they call it? Security gathering, I can't remember.
Security Council? No.
It's just been on just recently as well in Munich. And he made a speech there in 2007, which that's when he really said, okay, I've had enough. You haven't dealt with me properly. You haven't given me what I wanted. That's it. He didn't say we're at war, but he said something very close to it. And effectively, there's been that sort of state of war and crisis ever since. Before that, he wanted the recognition of Russia as a great power, and therefore with the right to a sphere of influence.
Yeah.
Over which it had control. And that was something that the West, we could talk about why, wasn't prepared to give him. It wasn't really prepared to treat him as a great power. So there was the famous time when Putin said, well, we could join NATO, why not? And that quote is quoted all the time, but it's never quoted what he said after that, immediately after that. He said, but as an equal, only as an equal, of course as an equal. And when he said as equal, which is a word that he uses all the time, he doesn't mean equal to Estonia or to even to France. He means equal to the United States.
Yeah. Okay.
And the United States is not going to treat Russia as an equal. It's just not going to happen. So by 2007, he had enough. He'd had enough, and ever since then, it's just been cranked up. Okay.
So just to be clear, from my own understanding, the old Soviet states, is it Latvia, Estonia,
Lithuania,
Latvia,
Latvia,
Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova,
Moldova, Belarus,
yes,
and then the Central Asian states, all the stans.
Yeah, okay, all the stans.
Yeah,
so up to Turkey.
And then in Caucasus, you've got Armenia, Azerbaijan.
Yeah, okay.
Probably going to forget somebody and really insult some people, but I think I've got them all.
So that was Soviet Union. I'm pretty sure I've read as well him saying before his term, either he wants to take over Ukraine like previously, correct me if I'm wrong, or reinstate the Soviet kind of, like you said, the sphere of influence.
Yeah, well, he said different things, but basically he said that, we have a right to guarantee our security to a sphere of influence. He'd see that sphere of influence as mainly in Europe to protect him from the Europeans and from the Americans and NATO and so on and so forth. In the Caucasus as well, you would expect to have considerable say over what goes on there. Let's not talk about Central Asia because it's a different story where he's face to face with the Chinese, and that adds a completely different dimension to it. But I think it's true to say I think I can use the word obsession. His obsessions are with relationships with the United States and with the West, and therefore where do places like Ukraine, and the Baltic States keep coming up, and the Baltic States are members of NATO.
Yeah.
And he's been asked about, what are your plans regarding the Baltic States? He said, look, I have read Article 5. He said that on a number of occasions, the article in the NATO treaty that says an attack on one country, member of NATO, will be taken as an attack on all. Everybody sits around thinking, gee, I wonder whether the United States would actually go to war with Russia if Russia invaded Estonia. Nobody's absolutely sure. But at the moment, Putin at least has always said that, I've read Article 5. I'm not going to take on the Baltic States. Obviously, that's one of the reasons why he's pretty keen not to have Ukraine or Georgia, for that matter, in NATO. Those two countries that NATO has said that, at some stage we'll admit you.
Okay. Do you think Russia is worthy of having that equal status to America?
No. It's not worthy of it. Let's just talk in realpolitik terms. It hasn't got the strength, it hasn't got the power to be an equal to America. So if it takes America on, it's going to suffer the consequences, and we're seeing that at the moment. When we're not quite sure in the long term what the consequences will be, but they'll be serious. They've taken them on, and they've got a dirty, they've got a bloody nose at the moment. It would appear that it's not going to end well for Russia. It's probably not going to end very well for Ukraine. It's not going to end well for Russia. I mean, my view of the things, and it's very easy for me to say this, the Russia, Putin, the Russians, okay, let's talk in a collective term, even if that might not be fair to all of them. They have a great power complex. They think that, we're big and we've got lots of stuff and therefore we're a great power.
Yeah.
But, when it comes down to it, they're not really. And even if they are, what they have to do in order to exert themselves, both domestically and in foreign policy terms, as a great power, does them a lot of harm. They've just got to get over it. Just say, we're not a great power. We'll just I'll tell you a story. I've got a very, very close friend in Moscow who is a hardcore Russian patriot.
Mhm.
In 2007, he's a person, not in the center of power, but he has the sort of job that he's sort of in those areas.
In those circles, yeah.
In 2007, after Putin's speech in Munich in February 2007, I was in Moscow that European summer, and I was having a beer with my friend Alexei, and I was quite worried about what was going to happen. I'm worried about what it means for Russia. And so I told him the story. I said, look, Australia is, when it comes down to it, we're the United States deputy sheriff and we're China's quarry. And it can be quite humiliating, when you think about it. It's not, but we put up with it. We sort of just accepted. It's got a bit more complicated since, I know, but at the time we just sort of accepted it, and we do okay. We do pretty well.
We do great.
And he understood exactly. He's a very sharp guy. He knew exactly what this story was getting at, that Russia should simply accept the same sort of status. And what was his response? And he was completely serious. He wasn't making a joke. He said to me in this really sad tone, because we're great friends, he said, oh my God, Stephen, what must it be like to live in a shitty little country like Australia? And I thought, you'll never learn. You'll never learn.
Is that because they're just living in that like Soviet past kind of thing?
Not just the Soviet past, it's the Tsarist past. Russia had the same obsessions back then as well. I'm a little bit of a geographical determinist, it has to say. Geography has a fair degree, big influence on things. I just think the fact that Russia is really big, they have this vision of themselves as being sort of the bridge or halfway between Europe and Asia. Well, I should say that these are the sorts of things I said to Alexei as well. Australia it's a bit similar. We don't quite know where we belong in the world because we're sort of European, but we're stuck out there at the end of Asia. We sort of think we're a bit this and that. We're the same. So I was making all these parallels. But the Russians, they get this idea that they're very unique, they're exceptional. There's obviously another country in the world that we could talk about that's got the same view of itself, better or for worse. But they think of themselves as exceptional, they're special, they've got all this stuff, all these natural resources and everything. Therefore, they have this natural right to be special and exceptional. And they can never quite pull it off. That's the trouble. They can never quite pull it off. And so then they get a bit embittered about it. They get the sense that we've been humiliated. We're not treated as an equal. We're not treated properly. And it just becomes a psychological mess as much as anything else. I don't, maybe I'm exaggerating these things in the telling, but there definitely is that element there to the Russian psyche that creates enormous problems for themselves.
Do you think, obviously you can't speak for the Russian people, but you obviously know people, like you said, you understand that psyche. Do you think regular people are pro the invasion, or is it just like the elite class? Because apparently there's a massive elite class in Russia. I know you've done some work in that, but what's your opinion on the regular people versus
it's elite? Obviously a very, very big question at the moment. I'm a fair bit way away, but my wife is Russian. And we have friends and relatives in Moscow, and not just in Moscow. And so, we're a little bit cautious about the way we talk about it, not because I don't think at the moment we're worried that somebody might be listening in and get them into trouble. No, it's just that matter of being polite. We don't want to make things harder for these poor people by, what do you bloody well think about it? Why aren't you opposing? Have you been out in the streets? We don't want it. Generally, when I'm in Russia, it's quite interesting. Lots of my friends and my wife's relatives, I've known them for decades. We're really close, but we don't talk about politics. And I actually don't know what their political views are. Obviously, there are people that I do know what their political views are and we talk about, but there's lots of them. It's just not something we talk about. But anyway, so we do have those contacts there. We were actually in Russia in 2013, 2014 during the Crimea affair. So we had a real sense of what things were like there then. And my guess is that it's not greatly different now. It was really terrible. The levels of propaganda, you wouldn't believe it. It was just really shocking. in terms of the way that people then reacted, well, as you know, there was this huge upsurge of patriotism. And that wasn't something that was manufactured, and it was genuine. It was quite extraordinary. People that I just never, ever expected it of, saying to me, oh, isn't it wonderful? You know, we've got up off our knees, you know, we're a great power again. We've seized Crimea, for Christ's sake, you know, it wasn't exactly a major military victory. Now, you know, there's things going on at the moment are a little bit more serious in seizing Crimea. You get the impression at the moment that the Russians, they don't know what's going on, and they don't want to know what's going on. So the media, you know, the standard media, I would imagine, well, my wife actually subjected herself to standard Russian TV the other night just for a couple of hours streaming it. You know, it's certainly no better than it was back in 2014 when it was really unbelievable. I mean, we're talking about talk shows where they're talking about, you know, Nazi people crucifying and torturing Ukrainians, torturing Russians, and the audience all there chanting and screaming, kill them, kill them, kill them. You know, that's what it was like. I don't imagine it's much different. So people don't want to know, they don't know and they don't want to know because they don't get information. More and more every day, what more or less independent news sources there were are being closed down. Most of the population never, ever have looked or watched or listened to those sources anyway. So they don't know, they don't want to know, but even to the extent that they do know, you just hear all too often, including among people we know, that bloody Ukrainians are getting what they deserve. So, you know, I'm a political scientist, and in political science, you know, the big issue is always the people who don't know and don't want to know, the apathetic, let's say. So when the crunch really comes, which way will they go? I saw a poll figure came out yesterday from Moscow. So it was a poll that had a whole list of things. What do you think are the most important things, or what do you think are major things that have happened in the last couple of weeks? And you didn't have to just tick one, you could tick multiples. Sanctions was ticked by 9% of people. So 9% of people in Russia at the moment think that sanctions is a major issue. Happening. They just haven't got a clue. They just don't have a clue. So those that do have a clue, a lot of them are, you know, they're patriots. Some, you know, I know these people personally. Sometimes they're people who they worry about it. And in the end, they say my country's right or wrong. And I don't say that I respect their position. That's a bit hard, but you know, they're close friends of mine, and I'm not going to, you know, say, oh, I can't have anything more to do with you over this or anything like that. I can't do it. And I have to say, well, okay, you're a Russian, you've got the right to feel that. I've got no choice. But it is upsetting when it's pretty widespread.
But with social media and like internet, I'm assuming in most of Russia there's internet access. Wouldn't they see like videos of what's going on and things like that? Or is it they don't have access, or is it blocked, or things like that? Well, is it just,
you know, we read all the time in the West that, you know, people get from social media and so on what they want to see and what they want to know.
Of course.
I don't imagine that Russians are any different.
And
so I've got lots of friends who are absolutely horrified. I've got some very close friends who go out to every demonstration. Completely they're horrified. I got an email from one of them, from the wife this morning, saying, can you just answer this email? Did you get it? Our internet's not working. Now, I haven't heard that the internet in Russia has been turned off. So I said to her, you know, I replied, said, yeah, I got it. What do you mean? And I haven't got a response from her yet. But yeah, no, you know, Russians are no greatly different from other people. Most people, half the people in Australia haven't got a clue what's going on.
I bet, actually. That's a good way to frame it for me.
They're looking for reinforcement for what they already believe.
Yeah, what they already think. Yeah, exactly.
And these are psychological things. You know, it's not easy if you're a Russian, you know, and some bloody people there in the West are telling you that your country is up to all sorts of ill deeds and everything. You're not terribly interested in it. Nevertheless, you know, why would you go out and believe what you see on some Ukrainian Ukrainian video clip. You're not going to believe it.
That you said it before. I was going to touch on it. The whole denazifying Ukraine, is that all just bullshit, or is there some sort of claim that happened in the past, or is it just like evoking World War II sentiment?
Yeah, use your question. Are there any Nazis in Ukraine?
Well, I don't even know that whole claim that we're denazifying Ukraine.
Yeah. Look, I'll be honest with you that in 2013, 2014, when the shit really hit the fan, to put it in those terms.
Crimea, was that 2000?
Crimea,
yeah.
And I just want to, it's always worth keeping in our mind, that problem all started not when Ukraine announced it was going to join NATO, it was when Ukraine, and the president at the time was a pro-Russian president elected from eastern Ukraine, that though he was going to go off and sign a partnership agreement with the European Union. He turned up in Moscow a week before he was due to sign the agreement, came back saying, oh, we've changed our mind, we're not going to sign it after all. And that's what started the Maidan, the great, everybody went out in the street in Ukraine. He eventually fled. The new government was set up, and that's when Putin seized Crimea. So it didn't come from Ukraine joining NATO. It came from Ukraine going to sign a partnership agreement with the European Union. It was an economic relationship, not a security relationship. But anyway, back then, throughout my studies of the Soviet Union, I'm interested in bureaucracy and bureaucratic procedures, and so I'm not interested in ethnic issues. I was reasonably ignorant. I knew that Russia, the Soviet Union, obviously had lots of republics and so on and so forth. It wasn't my field. So what I knew about Ukraine was, I knew that West Ukraine had been part of Poland, had been parts of lots of places, but had been part of Poland and was incorporated into Ukraine, that is the Soviet Union, in 1939 as part of the deal with Hitler. And I knew that Stalin had taken over in true Stalinist way, and it was a very, very nasty, bloody affair. So I knew that there were lots of these people, Ukrainians in West Ukraine, that had no reason to like the Soviet Union and not always distinguish between the Soviet Union and Russia. I knew that, or I read about it. I knew that East Ukraine was much more Russian, you could say. Much more Russian speaking, much more people who had come from Russia to work in factories and so on and so forth after the war and so on. So I wouldn't say I was prepared to believe the story that there was this bunch of people who might have even had some sort of Nazi sympathies in West Ukraine, and there were all these good Russians in East Ukraine. But I was prepared to think, well, maybe this is a country which is a bit split down the middle. And so when the stories in the Russian media started appearing in sort of late 2013 through 2014 about pogroms and massacres and people having their tongues cut out for speaking Russian and children being crucified and all this sort of stuff, I didn't believe that. There was no way I was going to believe that. And I thought, well, what is going on? And you think, well, how do I get information? There were some Russian newspapers at the time, and still going. They're not opposition newspapers, but they're newspapers, one in particular, it's a business newspaper. It's interested in economics, not politics. It doesn't editorialize, but it prides itself on presenting what's going on. So I read that, and back then it had its correspondent in Kiev, and he was traveling all over East Ukraine looking for the pogroms and the massacres. And he'd ask people, and some of them would say, what are you talking about? It's just rubbish. There's no such stuff going on at all. I'm Russian, but nobody's ever cut the tongue out or anything like that. Incidentally, if you see all those video things at the moment coming out of Ukraine, they're all talking Russian. It's Russian is what you hear all the time. All these people are supposed to have been killed in the genocide, all these Russian speakers, but they're still there. Anyway, that's me getting a bit excited. Get excited. So either the responses they were getting was there's nothing going on at all, or, oh yeah, no, it's terrible, it's dreadful what these Ukrainians, these fascists are up to. Oh, so what, here? No, down the street, down in Wollongong. So they go down to Wollongong. Oh, no, it's not here. It's up in Sydney. You have to go up to Sydney to find it. And they never ever managed to find anything. Clearly there was, there were incidents and there was dislikes and so on. But what the picture that Russia is. And then as we were in Moscow with friends, and in other parts, we were in Kazan for a while and in the village and places around the village where we got the house, just getting into casual conversations. It's usually my wife that gets into these casual conversations, not me. I don't want to impose myself there as a foreigner, and they pick me as a foreigner pretty quickly. She's not going out trying to get people to talk about Ukraine. It's just chatting.
Yeah.
And when I say over and over again, I suppose there would have been 12, 14, 15 cases, I suppose, in a couple of months. People saying, oh, we don't know what's going on in Ukraine. We've got relatives there. We've got really good friends there. And suddenly they won't talk to us. We ring them up and say, oh, you're all right. You're all right. You know, all these terrible things happening. Just leave us alone, you effing Russians, and hang up. Don't want to talk to us. What's going on? What's going on? Or else we ring up our relatives and say, oh, you know, are you all right? Are you all right? Of course we're all right. Of course we're all right. Nothing's going on. Nothing's happening. Just leave us alone. And I heard that often enough from in these are circumstances in which nobody's going to, you know, they're not saying this to tell me a story, you know, and invent something. It's just casual conversations in a shop. And it was often enough that you thought, yeah, no, look, it's just rubbish, just total rubbish. And I would say that, you know, no reason to believe that the stories that have been peddled around Russia at the moment are any different.
So how, from like 2013, this like propaganda kind of narrative started? So, you know how you were saying people don't really know there. So, and the propaganda is like very rife. So from 2013, would you say there was kind of like a narrative, or has it always been the case because of that sentiment to always reclaim that Soviet?
But before 2013, was there a background, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to be a bit careful here because it's not really my specialization. There has always been in the Soviet Union a narrative of fascist Nazis in West Ukraine and in the Baltic States, of, you know, a degree of truth to that. There were people in those countries that thought the Soviet Union was their greater enemy, more than the Russians, more than the Germans. Often the West Ukrainians are called Banderovцы in Russian, that supporters of Bandera, and Simon Bandera was a Ukrainian nationalist in West Ukraine, who did fight on the side of the Germans. The Russians don't mention the fact that at times he also fought on the side of the Soviet Union. I mean, he fought on whichever side that he thought was going to be better for Ukrainian independence. But so, yeah, there's always been that narrative there that, you know, there are elements in that country that were not on our side during the war. So I suppose there was that always there that could be built up and built up. Obviously, you know, the links between Ukraine and Russia are very, very close, and they're very historical, and all sorts of people have relatives on both sides and so on and so forth. My wife will say to me, you know, she's no friend of Putin, as far away from being a friend of, is absolutely distraught at what's going on at the moment. But she will say, you know, Russians, Ukrainians, they're one people. You know, we're one people. Ukrainians don't appear to actually feel that way themselves at the moment. Not even the Russian-speaking ones. They're pretty doubtful about whether they feel that way, as best as we can tell. But the background was there. In 2013, I can remember being a little bit surprised by, you know, in the village where we live, which is a very poor village, there were refugees coming from Donetsk. And this is a time when there was genuine warfare. So these people are in 2014, 15, you know, there was warfare, bombardments and go on. So they're genuine refugees coming from the Russian part of Ukraine. And some of them were going to be put up in school or somewhere in the vicinity of where our house is in this village. And there were a lot of empty houses in the village because it's a terrible, you know, people are leaving all the time. And so there was talk about, oh, well, we might have put up these refugees. And our neighbour, who was no friend of Putin or anything, like, not particularly patriotic or anything else like that, but he just said, we don't need Hochli around here. Hochli is the Russian, it's not a term of abuse. It's not just like calling somebody a wog or something like that. It's like calling somebody a pom if he's an Englishman. But if it does have that, it can have that edge.
How you say it. kind of thing.
How you say it. So he wasn't saying, oh, these all people should be killed or something like that.
Yeah.
But he was talking about the Russians who are fleeing from the Ukrainians who are killing them.
Different,
And he just saw them as Hawkley, and we don't want them around here.
Yeah.
And I was quite surprised actually by that. It's partly because things are tough enough around here. We don't need a whole bunch of refugees sort of taking what work there is and so on. It was partly that, but I don't know whether it's the same as you sort of get a few tensions at times between Australians and New Zealanders or something.
Yeah, of course,
whether it's at that sort of, but there's something there that can be built on. And it would appear to have been built on. You certainly don't want to get too carried away about the brotherly love between fellow Slavs. Not greatly in evidence.
I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation. Those two regions, Donetsk and something starting with Donetsk, and the one starting with L?
Lugansk.
Yeah, could you explain that a bit if you have a bit of an understanding? So there's obviously Ukrainians that are pro-Russian, I'm assuming. So what are they fueled by, like Russian people funding them, or like what do you think the situation is with that? Or is there a genuine population of Ukrainians that just want to join with Russia?
Yeah, again, this is something I don't know personally. I've never been to Ukraine, much less to those two places. But those are, in the far east of Ukraine. So right on the Russian border. Yeah. So that is the part of Ukraine where traditionally, to some extent, it goes back, to Tsarist times. You're likely to have mixed populations in that area. But both in the 1930s, when there was a great famine in Ukraine, but also after the war, a lot of Russians were moved. I don't know exactly what the motivations were, but moved into those areas when there was high levels of industrialization. They built lots of big new factories and so on. And it tended to be Russian people who came to those areas so it became even more, let's say, Russified area than it had been previously. The same thing happened in the Baltic States, incidentally. So there are parts of the Baltic States that have very strong Russian populations. Yeah. The Baltic States used to be part of the Tsarist Empire, so there had always been Russians in those areas. But there was a big inflow of Russians after the Second World War, mainly to work in factories that were being built at that time. And so that was partly the story in Ukraine, in those eastern parts of Ukraine. I tell a story in the village. There's some people there who live there. They don't live there permanently. They're like us. They've just got a house there. They come from a place just outside Moscow. The man, I won't go into the full story. It takes too long and it's too complicated. But he actually grew up in that part of Ukraine. His father was an engineer who came from, let's say, Russia proper, when a big factory was built in that part of the world after the war, I think in 1948, he said. And so he was born and grew up there. And he has what I can only be called a racist attitude towards Ukrainians. It cannot be described in any other way whatsoever.
And he lives there?
Well, he actually went to Moscow and studied at Moscow University. And then I think this might be part of it, really. He and his wife, they both studied at Moscow University. And in those days, this was in the 1970s, when you finished university, you were told where you went to work. And they were sent to Kiev to work.
Yeah, okay.
And I think they were upset. I think they wanted to stay in Moscow. They didn't want to go to Kiev. And I think, there was a fair degree. You just had the feeling that, they'd been sent to the bloody boondocks and they didn't want to go to the boondocks. But anyway, I can remember him saying, and this is you hear this a lot, before we came, so before the Russians came and built these factories and everything, there was nothing here. There was nobody. There was nothing. We've given them everything that they've got. Yeah. I have to say the words terra nullius came into my mind when he said that, And I said, what do you mean? Literally, there was nobody here? And he said, oh, just a bunch of bunch of Ukrainian peasants. Yeah. That's what he said. And so I thought, well, it's not surprising that you weren't very popular when you were in Kiev. I got the impression. Yeah. That's the way you were talking about that. It's not terribly surprising. Yeah. So anyway, so what the people in that part of the world think, I'm sure there are people there who believe that they are absolutely totally Russians and their future should be with Russia, and whether it's within Ukraine, with a Ukraine that's very friendly to Russia, or a part of Russia itself. Of course, undoubtedly there are. These are people whose attitudes have been made much stronger by, what was a genuine, we could sort of say was something close to a civil war in that part of the world in 2014, 2015. An awful lot of people who lived in those places have fled to the Ukrainian part. I presume that is in some way they're voting with their feet. And other people have actually, as refugees, have gone to Russia itself or stayed in those republics which are totally under Russian control. So they've voted with their feet one way or the other as well. I'm sure there are people who would have liked to, who didn't get to vote with their feet. They had no choice but to stay where they were for whatever reason. But no, my guess is that in those republics at the moment, the people who are still there are probably not very friendly towards Ukraine. That would be my guess, but I don't know from personal experience. One thing I can say, that in the village again, a couple from Donetsk turned up. She was Russian and her sister lives in the village. So they fled. This was after all the fighting had finished. It might have been in 2016. And so they turn up. We just never happened to be there while they were there. So I never ever met them personally. So I'm just going to what our neighbours said, because they were living in a house directly across the road from ours. So our neighbours got to know them. And particularly our neighbour, the wife of our neighbour, she's a very nice, but a rather simple soul, I'd have to say. And just tends to believe what she sees and so on. And she was going on about these poor people who've had to fled the drug addicted, which is the word Putin still uses, the drug addicted, crazy militia guys running around the place with guns, shooting people and stealing their cars. And this was sort of in 2016 or something. And there couldn't possibly be any Ukrainian Nazis running around the streets of Donetsk in 2016. So I usually don't get involved in these sorts of discussions. I just sit and listen. But I said to her,
of course, you can't change people's minds unless they want it.
Who were these people running around the streets stealing cars and everything? Who were they? And she said, well, what do they call those? And her husband, who was a much sort of sharper character and pretty cynical in his views, he just said to her, the Bandierovцы, these supporters of Bandera. I think actually the reason they use Nazis all the time now is it's simply easier to remember the word and to pronounce it rather than Bandierovцы. She couldn't, but she said, oh yeah, them. And I said to her, there's no possible way that there can be any Bandierovцы running around the streets of Donetsk in 2016. They're 80 kilometers away. And she says, oh, I don't know. So these people, these refugees had turned up. They weren't running away from the Ukrainian Nazis. They were running away from their own people who were running around the streets stealing cars, requisitioning people's cars for military purposes. And, they're all a bunch of bandits and they shoot each other, to get control of the resources of the local place and everything. So I thought it was quite interesting. They were running away not from Ukrainian Nazis. They didn't last very long in the village. It would appear that living in Donetsk was more easier than living in Zhashova, as far as I could tell, because they went home pretty quickly. But yeah, you get those little, it's that sort of information, I suppose, that you don't get from reading newspapers or going on social networks and stuff like that, where Christ knows what you're reading or where it comes from.
Yeah, exactly.
But people who are saying things who haven't got a particular barrow to wheel at the time. It's just coming out in casual conversation. Even again in the village, these people's son, he doesn't live there anymore, but he came back just for some holidays, and so he's there with a bunch of his mates just from the local village, and they're just talking about, what their old school friends are doing. This is when, not long after, the Russians had to send in their troops into Lugansk and to Donetsk because the local militias were being overwhelmed by the Ukrainian army. So there were 30,000. And of course, we deny that they're there. There's no Russian troops there. And so I never believed that for a moment, but nevertheless, it's confirmation when these people are just chatting and they're just talking about what school friends are doing now. And one in Sasha, our next door neighbour, the young guy said, oh, so-and-so, Nikolai, whoever it was, is in the army and he's just come back from Donetsk, just so casually.
Yeah. So that
And
confirms
then,
it.
yeah, I mean, he had no reason to say, to
lie,
or anything else like that. He just said it totally casually. And then he described the way, he said, oh yeah, he told us this is the way it happens. You didn't have to go if you didn't want to, and the training and everything. And it was just absolutely everything that you knew was going on. So those sorts of information, you don't want to believe just because you spend time in a country that you know everything about it. You certainly don't want to fall into that trap. No. But if you get those just little bits of information that confirm or sometimes deny what you've got from other sources, it's reassuring that you're on the right track.
In terms of the conflict now, and how long do you think it'll take for the sanctions to really have an effect on the regular people, if it hasn't already?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's how quickly it's going to affect. Well, it's obviously got an effect on what their money is worth. Rubles already, is crashing. Imports, to the extent we don't know what imports are they going to be. Russia is very dependent on imports, but their imports come from all different places, from China and to Turkey and places that aren't necessarily going to join in the sanctions. And then there's questions about transport. If Maersk and these big shipping companies won't ship into Russia, so it's a bit hard to tell at this moment. But I would have thought that in terms of what their money is worth and in terms of what's in the shops, it's going to be quite sudden and quite quick. In the longer term, the sanctions, and maybe the Ukrainians and the Russians will do a deal tomorrow and the West will say, thank God for that, and we can get rid of the sanctions. Who knows? We don't know. But assuming it's going to go on a little bit more than that, the technological sanctions, they've got really, really serious now. If Russia can't import any microprocessors, it's not going to be immediate, but it's going to have a really big effect.
Can China carry
I'm sort of
that
hedging
load?
because I can't answer your question very precisely, and I'm just thinking.
It's all right. You can't predict the future.
But I guess the point of your question is when are the Russian people going to wake up to the fact that this is really, really serious, and more than 9%, are going to say that sanctions is really serious.
Yeah.
I think pretty quickly. Then the question then is, well, what is their response going to be? If sanctions are starting to affect them personally. I actually wrote in a thing for the conversation the other day. I said, you've got to come to a conclusion at the end, and you've got 800 words, so you come to a pretty blunt conclusion. I said, first of all, Russians judge their economic well-being at the moment compared to what it was like in the 1990s. It's going to have to get a hell of a lot worse before it's going to be what it was like in the 1990s. It'll probably take a while for sanctions to get things that bad.
Yeah.
And I said, so it's going to take a while for sanctions to even get to that level. I'm not sure that that's true, that they do measure their current well-being against the 1990s. There's an awful lot of people who can't remember the 1990s. They weren't around then, or they weren't old enough. Maybe they have got used to what is actually, if you live in the big cities, a very comfortable lifestyle. Very nice lifestyle, and they've got used to that. So maybe the sanctions will affect them. They'll have to think about, well, what do I do about this? Much more than I implied in that article.
But do the people actually
it's just
have a
whether
say?
They will go, the bastards are out to get us. And it will just reinforce their feeling that we are the victimized. Russians are pretty good on the victimization side of things. The world's been out to get us, and they've always been out to get us, and they're still out to get us. And this just shows it even more and more and more that they're out to get us. And so they'll, take on the attitude of the Second World War, which is something we're incredibly proud of. What we went through during the Second World War to defeat these bloody bastards who are coming from Western Europe to destroy us. It could well be that will be the reaction. I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest if that was the reaction. On the other hand, it might not be, because we've got different generations. Maybe, they'll just say, why are we going through all this just for Putin's crazy ideas about Ukrainians and stuff? Why we go? And the reaction might be quite the reverse. And we do know that, when things get really out of hand on the streets, it can happen very quickly. So it might happen. I have to, and to go further, you don't generally get revolutions just from the street. It generally takes something happening in the elite as well. So it has to be the people in the elite judging that, hell's bells, if we keep on going the way we are at the moment, supporting Putin, we're likely to end up hanging from a lamppost.
Yeah.
Bastards are going to get us, the mob out there are going to get us. So I think we better abandon ship now before it's too late. So who knows, that scenario might happen. To be perfectly honest, if I had to make a decision, what do I think will happen?
Yeah.
My guess is it's more likely to be the first scenario than the second. Yeah, that's
going into
the Russians will hunker down. They'll say, yeah, they're out to get us, my country, right or wrong. We've suffered before. We'll suffer again. Yeah. That would be my guess. I might be completely wrong, but that would be my guess. And to be perfectly honest, I don't know which scenario is. It's a pretty sad scenario. It's just devastating, really.
I was going to ask, Putin's nuclear threat. What do you think about that?
Well, one thing we've learned from Putin is the only thing that you can believe what he says is what he's going to do.
Yeah.
If he says he's going to do something, there's a fair chance that he'll do it.
Yeah.
Just about everything else he says is complete rubbish. But if he says that, there's a fair chance that he's going to do it. So I certainly wouldn't take his threats it's just him blathering on. But I suppose, a few weeks ago or 10 days ago, how long it was ago,
exactly.
I sort of thought, he's not stupid. It's not just that he's crazy enough, but he's not stupid enough. There's a difference between being crazy and being stupid.
Yeah.
I just couldn't believe that, one, he was crazy enough, or two, that he was stupid enough to do it. Again, the same calculations. He's crazy enough or stupid enough to use nuclear weapons. I just can't get my head around the thought that he might have. But then, as I said, 10 days ago, I was really struggling to get my head around the idea that he'd actually invade Ukraine. Because it's, for me, I tend to look at things from the point of view of the Russians. I mean, it's really important to me personally and emotionally. It's just so devastating for them.
I was going to ask, I read something and I think it said the West is dumb for thinking that everyone wants what the West has, that West kind of idea. And we're thinking sanctions will work because they want economic prosperity and all the capitalist stuff. But we're just, the arrogance is that we think that what we have, everyone else wants. So does that tie into you saying you think that there's the potential that they hunker down? We've been through this in the 90s, if that's what they're comparing it to. Yeah. And that kind of line of thinking.
Yeah, although I wouldn't make it to think that the Russians are some sort of anti-consumerist.
No,
no, they're not. They want to be able to sit in a cafe and have a beer or a cup of coffee just as much as anybody else does. They want to have nice clothes, and they're just as fashion conscious, and they want to have the clothes from. I don't know anything about clothes, but they don't want to have them knocked up at some place out in the backwoods of China if they can possibly avoid it. They're the same as everybody else in that regard. But when it came to the crunch, I think it's patriotism takes over. Not we're not so consumerist after all. It's patriotism that takes over. I would feel patriotism in that. Look, I suppose if we're patriotic, if it comes to the crunch, we say our country right or wrong. That's what most people, when it comes down to it, do. It takes a lot of whatever it takes to say, I don't accept it as my country, right or wrong. And I just don't get the impression that there's lots and lots of people in Russia who are going to come to that conclusion. And so they will give up, I would have thought, the consumerism. But maybe not, maybe you get very, over the last few years, you get very I'm not, how do I put it? I'm not a political scientist in the sense that I'm right into political polls and surveys and everything. That's not my field. But, you know, you keep a slight eye on it, and you get very contradictory messages from what young people in Russia think. You know, sometimes you think that, you know, you get the impression that they're, you know, Western style hedonists and they will do anything to protect their consumer levels. But on the other hand, you get evidence that they're not like that at all. For what it's worth, you know, I suppose I don't have lots of young friends, but for what it's worth, those that I do know, you know, they are patriots. They're not. And again, I wouldn't be surprised if it came to the crunch, that's the side that they would take. That's no country right or wrong. You know, even the moment when I stop and think about it, the people that I know, you know, sort of think they might not be terribly happy about it, but that's the side that they would go. That's just my guess. And so, again, you know, it's a horrible thing because I don't feel that I can blame them for it.
No.
But the consequences for other people and the consequences for them themselves are terribly serious.
So, do you think if that's the line they go down, Russia takes Ukraine based on, even though Ukraine's getting like funding from the West and whatnot, they're still fighting it themselves, and there's obviously a population difference. So if that's the avenue, no matter what kind of thing, do you think Russia would take Ukraine and then that's it? Or it'll just continue? And another question I wanted to ask was, do you think that this kind of thing is like a symbol for the decline of the West?
Well, first question. Yeah, look, I don't know. You get the impression, you don't know how much it depends on Putin himself. He's not going to be around forever. So, you know, the gathering of the lands, you know, the taking over everything, restoring the Soviet Union, it's not going to happen, you know, quickly. So who knows? He might keel over in a couple of years' time, and a new leader. I wouldn't, you know, you don't want to be sort of all starry-eyed that you get rid of Putin and
I was going to say
new person who's just going to declare peace. That's very far from the probabilities, but it might be somebody quite different. So who knows? In terms of, you know, my guess is, to be honest, that he's not out to get the Baltic States.
Because they're NATO.
You know, I think he'll say, oh, look, bugger that. They are members of NATO. You know, there might be a significant Russian population in those countries that we could use to build up something like we've done in Ukraine. But if I had to say, again, make my decision, I'd say, yeah, no, he won't. You know, next step, Ukraine, Moldova, he's already got Belarus. Would he put more pressure on Georgia?
I was going to say Georgia next.
I can't see any possible reason to believe that he wouldn't, to be perfectly honest. Why would he not?
If he's already done it once and nothing happens.
I mean, it's easy to say Ukraine is a special case. It's very big. It's, you know, it's part of the Russian soul and everything else like that. It might.
They've already got Crimea.
But I certainly wouldn't sort of assume that he won't. I mean, he's okay. He invaded Georgia in slightly different circumstances, but nevertheless, he's done it before. So no, I don't think he'd just say, "Oh, pack up and Ukraine's enough." I mean, I think, you know, if they get hold of Ukraine, it depends slightly on the circumstances. You know, if the Ukrainians surrender tomorrow, which they might, I don't get the impression that Zelensky is, you know, he's obviously a very tough character. He's, you know, it's not just going to go lie down and die, but I don't get the impression that he's a complete fanatic who's going to condemn him and his entire country to be just absolutely leveled and decimated. I don't. So who knows what he might do, or what deal the Russians might offer him. But you get the impression, one way or the other, it's going to take the Russians a long time to digest Ukraine. A long time. So even just on those grounds, it might keep them back from going further. So look, I don't expect the Russian hordes descending upon Paris tomorrow. That's certainly not what I expect. In terms of weakness of the West, obviously Zelensky is trying to up the pressure on the West and NATO at the moment. and I can well understand why.
Of course.
Is that a sign of weakness that we say, oh, we're a bit worried about Putin and his nuclear weapons, so we won't go any further? I don't know if that rates as a sign of weakness. One thing I think I can say quite conclusively is that Putin consistently overestimates the West's weakness. He keeps doing it. I think he believes his own propaganda. If you go there, you'll get the endless propaganda about the West is full of lesbians and gays and pathetic people like that. And
everyone's weak.
It's all just decadent and everything. And you get that all the time. And so I think he's perhaps partly believed his own propaganda to some extent. So I don't think there's any doubt in 2014, as in the end, particularly from this perspective, as mild as the sanctions might have been back then, I have no doubt whatsoever that they were much, much tougher. There was much, much more unanimity within the West than he expected. You know that because he gave up the Novorossiya project. He gave up then trying to do what he's trying to do now. Because he got more of he got more pushback from the Ukrainians than he expected, but I think he got more pushback from the West than he expected. And my guess is that he never expected for a moment, to be perfectly honest, I didn't either. I didn't expect this almost unanimous, every company in the world, well, not in the world, in the Western world, IKEA has pulled out of Russia.
Apple has as well.
It's not always out of the goodness of their hearts. It's because they've been put lots of pressure on them from Western governments and everything else like that. I know that. But nevertheless, I don't think he expected for a moment that sort of response. And so in that sense, whether the West ultimately is weak or not, they're not as weak as he thought. And he's paid some, a price for that, but getting it wrong. Getting it wrong twice. That's what I can't understand. Why didn't he learn the lessons of 2014? One, that the Ukrainians will put up a fight. Okay, you got Crimea easy, but he couldn't get what he wanted in Donetsk, in the Donbass, because the Ukrainians put up a fight, and the West was more united than he possibly expected. So why didn't he learn the lessons? Who does he get his information from?
Well, I was going to say, like, talking to my friends about it and stuff, we're trying to put ourselves in like Putin's position. It's like I'm assuming no one really disagrees with you and you kind of get whatever you want constantly. So I'm sure you'd have an ego complex and, like you said, believe your own propaganda. So I mean, and especially like as you're getting older and you've had all these visions of what you want to achieve, I'm sure you just go like hell bent on achieving it. But I'm not sure.
When you're a political scientist, and a political scientist has always approached things from sort of rational actor theory side of things, I've always felt uncomfortable about political culture type explanations, psychology and national culture. I've always felt uncomfortable about that. I much prefer, we sit down and we calculate. We might get the calculations wrong, and you might have calculated wrong in 2013 and you got it wrong. And we got all the messages from the agents of influence and everybody in 2014. Oh yeah, we miscalculated there. We thought we'd go further, but we learned our lesson and we're not going to do that anymore. We got all those stories whispering in our ears. We got all those stories and it's just rubbish. So I've always been very reluctant. You like to think that the person on the other side of the fence is rational. Okay, you might get things wrong, but at least he's rational. At the moment, for all those sorts of reasons that you just put forward, you don't even have to go that you've gone completely psycho before you get to the level that the information that he's getting and his ability to process that information is also so compromised by age, as I say. I hate to say that, but by age, by some clear obsessions that he's got. And, and as you said, just surrounding yourself with yes men. I don't know if you saw that or that meeting of the Security Council, the Russian Security Council, on the 21st of February, which happened to be my 70th birthday. It was. I have never seen anything more extraordinary in all my life. So the Security Council, the Russian Security Council, doesn't make these big decisions or anything, but it's made up of all the top security people. You know, the head of the FSB, the KGB, the head of the internal security forces and spying services and all this sort of stuff. We've been of the opinion that Putin is surrounded by these characters from the security forces, most of whom go back a long way with Putin, where his mates back in the KGB or even, you know, all that back in that time. They're all hardliners. They are hardcore hardliners. So we thought these are the guys that he
turns to,
gets his advice from, and he talks to, and he decides things with. So this meeting comes along, and he said, okay, I haven't talked to any of you people about this in advance because I want to get your sort of genuine feelings. But what do you think about the idea that we should recognize Donetsk and Lugansk as independent states? And that was the feed in. Then the Russians said, okay, we have to send troops once we recognize these states, send in troops to protect them. And that led to the invasion.
Yeah.
So first of all, he said, maybe it was not true, but he said, I haven't spoken to you people about this in advance. Yeah. It's a bit extraordinary that he hadn't.
Yeah.
And then they all, one way or the other, showed that they were completely out of the loop. They didn't quite know what was going on. Or to the extent that they did, they were sort of very uncertain about it. They weren't too happy about what was going on. So Patrushev, who was he's the head of the Security Council, the apparatus, the Secretary of the Security Council, an old mate of Putin, considered to be the hardest of hardliners, regularly rants on about the West out to destroy Russia and everything else like that. And he said, maybe we should give the Americans a few more days to think about this. Which, you know, you take as a message, maybe we should take a few more days to think about this as well.
Yeah.
Putin slaps him down. He just totally humiliated these people.
Yeah.
And you look at the end of it, you think, well, who does he listen to?
Yeah.
If he doesn't listen to these guys, who does he listen to? You know, you got to the end, you thought, well,
scary
people were sounding like relatively restrained compared to him and whoever he does talk to. It was, you got the impression that probably, you know, the only person that sounded vaguely in the loop was the Minister of Defence. Maybe he's just listening to the military. The Minister of Defence, he's not of a military background. As it happens, he probably doesn't understand military affairs particularly well himself. And he was a Komsomol, a young communist, junior young Komsomol manager in the Soviet times in the middle of Siberia. He would have not the vaguest clue in the way the world works. He would just not have the slightest idea.
Yeah.
At least people like Narishkin, these hardcores, at least they are intelligence people. They're business. They might get all the wrong, they might interpret it wrong, but at least they have some idea of what's going on in the world. Whereas I thought, if the only person you listen to is Shoigu and a bunch of generals, no wonder you're getting it wrong. It's just, it was the most extraordinary thing. And it was all on TV, this transcript published.
That's a scary thought.
Just sit down. No, we don't need to hear any more of you. And one poor guy, this is the head of the external intelligence organization, the spying organization. He said, yes, I agree. He said, no, I will agree. He used the future tense. I will agree. After we've checked a few things, we might give them a few more days. Putin says, you will agree or do you agree? I agree in the present tense. So what do you agree to? I agree to Lugansk and Donetsk becoming part of the Russian Federation.
Yeah.
Because that was not the proposal. The proposal was that they be recognized as independent states. Putin says, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about them being recognized as independent states. I agree that they should be recognized as independent states. This is the head of, the equivalent to ACES, or the equivalent to the head of MI6 or the CIA. And this is the way, Study had no idea what was going on. And this is the way he was treated. It was quite extraordinary.
And it was on TV.
I'd never seen anything. Yeah, I'd never ever seen anything like it in my life before, in any country, I would say. Not even Donald Trump could manage that sort of level of completely off the planet.
Oh, that's very scary. Well, okay, I have two more questions. Okay. Do you think it could get to a stage where US sends troops into Ukraine, or that won't happen because they're not NATO?
Yeah, no, look, I don't think that would happen.
And the West will
I
just
just
let Russia
can't.
take Ukraine, kind of thing.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
can't see the US sending troops into Ukraine. No.
Okay.
I suppose the only thing that you might wonder is, and I'm not a military person, or I'm not a logistics person, whether they would really ramp up the providing of military support and aid in a really, really, really big way. Would they say, oh, look, there's a couple of, I don't know, as I said, I'm not a military person, but these are super weapons just sitting here on the border, please, come and take them. I don't know.
Yeah.
But, the actual Americans fighting on the side, I can't see that.
And do you think China is watching how the West responds to Ukraine, and that'll determine their response with Taiwan? It's not your area, but
again, I'm not a military type strategist or anything like that. I'm a specialist on bureaucratic decision making.
I just wanted your opinion on it.
So, what are the bureaucrats in China at the moment thinking, or do the bureaucrats in China at the moment have any say whatsoever? You've got another guy who, thinks he runs the world. He's the cleverest person in the world, and he thinks he runs the world there. So, what are they thinking? They probably, specifically in terms of Taiwan, there's two ways of looking at it, isn't it? The West is not going to come and defend Taiwan. That's one way of looking at it, so we might as well take it. I think it's true to say that the United States has expressed the view, and I don't follow it closely, but I think relatively recently has said we will militarily support Taiwan. Nobody knows whether they actually would or not, but they've said that in a way that they've never said that. In fact, they've always said the reverse about Ukraine. We will not. So there is that difference.
Yeah.
That the commitment to Taiwan is greater than the commitment to Ukraine has ever been. But nevertheless, she might take it as a sign of Western weakness, but my guess is that not. The other lesson that he might get was actually, it seems like invading another country, even if you think it's yours, is a bit more complicated than it seems.
Yeah.
That you've got a big fight on your hands.
Yeah.
So even regardless of what the Americans might do, the Ukrainians didn't lie down and die, so maybe the Taiwanese won't lie down and die. So there's two different messages that he might get.
Yeah.
I'd like to think that it would be the second message that he'd take the most notice of, to be honest.
I think we all would. You don't know. Well, thank you so much, Stephen, for coming on. That was very,
hope
very
I didn't get carried away too much.
No, that was great. That was honestly very informative. I've learned a lot, and it's very contemporary with what's happening right now. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for coming on.
Been a pleasure. Okay.